Hi, this will be the first official episode of this project, and it's talking about the book that really caused me to start this project, and it is John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. This book um, really is an American classic. I think John Steinbeck is probably the author that if you wanted to understand what it is to be an American, not just American values, but what it is to be an American, John Steinbeck is probably the author that does it the best. There's a lot of reasons for this, which we'll get into later. But first, the context in which I read this book. Um, Despite being only about 400 pages long in this version, and I usually read about a page a minute, is generally what I end up reading. This book took me 8 months to finish, and there's a reason for that. This book I started when I just arrived at a summer camp that I was working at, and so I got through like the first third, and then camp officially started, and I just never found the time or could will myself to read because I was always so tired. So it just kind of sat. It was the book that I kept in my car for a long time as my car book. So if I ever had the opportunity to read while I was sitting around waiting for something, it was in the car for me. And because of that, I never went out of my way to read it. So I started in May, finished about the first third of the book, then took 7 months off from reading it, picked it up back in late December, so I finished this book in late December. So this is about 7-8 months of not reading this book, and I had reread the first third again before I had finished the book. The reason why I couldn't bring myself to read this book, and the reason why I think that this book is not very well liked for many high school students, is because the first half or so is just not fun and interesting. For me, at least. This book covers a lot of diverse topics. It covers the issues of the family. It covers issues of gender, of economics, of immigration. Immigration is probably the one that this is best read as, and then economics second. But for me, this first half of the book focuses a lot on family dynamics and focuses a lot on the pure economics of what was going on in America during the late 1920s and into the 1930s after the start of the Great Depression. Because of that, and because of the way it's structured, that first half to me just isn't very interesting. It kind of slogs through, and as someone who doesn't really read books for family dynamics, it just isn't interesting. But once they get into kind of the New Mexico area, which they just kind of skip over, and then the California area, which is about halfway through, this book becomes the classic that it is. This last half of the book makes up for the dragging that happens in the first half. And there's a lot of reasons for this, but I think mostly it's because it gives a very clear dynamic of American capitalism at this time, and even to this day, of how labor actually works and how immigration actually works. This book overall covers really the economics of America really well, and it's economics that we still see today, of this idea of, we need all these people to work. In reality, the work is incredibly short, and they hire too many people for it, so you don't get paid enough, and because you don't get paid enough, you starve, and then you have to look for the next job, which is then, and it continues a cycle and a cycle and a cycle of what being an American laborer is like when we don't have, or when our forced minimum wage is not enough to survive on for a family. Also, in immigration, this book, I think, really does a really nice job of showing what this idea of being an outsider is like, and being forced into a new situation in which you have given up everything to then try to make it anew in a new place, in a new world, and just not getting anything from people, and getting no help and no support. And there's a really great analogy that occurs pretty late into the book, but it's the idea of, if a farmer had horses, even when those horses weren't productive and it was the winter time and there was no plowing, the horses would still be fed and the horses would still be cared for. But the other humans that surround them are somehow not needed. They are somehow expected that they can just find work wherever, they can just fend for themselves or wherever, which just isn't the case, right? And, because of that situation, I think this becomes an American classic. Also, talking about gender, I think this book does a really nice job of exploring the gender dynamics of expectations. The men in this book care a lot about the very physical reality that surrounds them, while the women in this book have a sense of caring of dignity and family and of doing the right thing. And it's a really interesting dynamic. And I think that all comes to a head in the very, very final scene, which final scene confuses a lot of people, and it confused me too when I initially read it, and then I reread the last chapter, and really the final 2 pages is about the last giving of hope for a country that has fallen apart. It draws a lot of similarities to the Bible in terms of, and John Steinbeck does that a lot, in which he includes biblical references, and Rose of Sharon is one of them, and about the nursing of Jesus, but also I think it draws a lot of parallels into Rome, interestingly enough, and the story of Romulus and Remus being floated down a river and then being adopted by a wolf, and then being fed the breast milk of the wolf. I think there's parallels there, and I don't know if John Steinbeck really wanted there to be parallels there, but I think that's a very viable reading of what it's like. Or I think it's a very viable reading of the last chapter, and really the overall story of the idea. I think it's a very viable reading of the overarching story that the world is collapsing and American society is collapsing, and all we can do is reform and rebuild from this point onwards, which I think was very, very true and still stands true to this day. I probably give this book an 8 out of 10. I don't know what that quite means yet. It's a classic, and it should be a classic, and it should be read. However, the first half drags it down. The first third drags it down, however long that portion of the book is. But other than that, it's just such a fantastic book. The only issue that I see going forward is that this book is not going to be liked by conservatives because it is too anti-American. It's kind of anti-capitalism. It's anti-police. That's a whole thing. But also, I don't think this book is going to be well liked by liberals going forward because it's about Americans immigrating, which is a weird thing to say, and it's about Southerners. Specifically, it's about Southern Americans, which is a whole nother topic of how the elite and liberals in this country have a tendency to look down upon Southerners because they have accents and because they don't sound smart. But they're just people, right? They're people and people matter. I think if this book was rewritten today and all you did was change them from being a family from Oklahoma to being a family from a South American country, I think this book suddenly becomes one of the greatest books ever written, simply because now it is a story about immigration into the United States and the struggles of that, rather than the struggles of American moving into a different part of America. I think that's what is going to hold this book back in the future, is just this idea of it is about a Southern American family. It is not about someone that we think of when we think of the issues of immigration in this country and how immigrants are treated in this country. But it should be read, and I think that this book is actually a great way to get around the issues of like CRT and all of that, because it is about white Americans and it is about immigration of white Americans. And then if we, as teachers, then can expand upon that and go, the exact situation I've provided of, can we switch this into a new context and can we still sympathize with them? I think that would be very powerful, and I think that was a way for this book to still be read and still be taught in American schools. Overall, great book. I think John Steinbeck is a fantastic author that is one of the most American voices ever published, because he's not afraid to be anti-American, and that is weirdly a very American value and one that I appreciate a lot. And that's it. That is my thoughts of John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. Officially, I read it in total in 7 months. In reality, I probably read it in about a week. And that's that. Thank you.